And the story I'm going to start with is true. It's in a part of the world where it is common for pastors' wives to have a choir. And this pastor's wife was no exception. She has a choir. They're traveling on Sabbath. I don't know if they had traveled a long ways, but anyways, as they're traveling home, they have to stop by, one of those road stops, kind of maybe like a truck stop where you walk into the truck stop and, the bathroom. You got to wander around through all kinds of gifts and other things until you get to the bathroom. You know how it goes, okay? So her choir stops. They start to wander through the place to go back to the bathroom, and she spots something that she really wants. Now, I really wish I knew what it was. I don't know what the item was, but I do know she really, really wanted it. And so she's then thinking, okay, now she's got a problem because it's Sabbath. She knows she shouldn't buy on Sabbath. So she's trying to figure out, okay, how do I get this thing that I really, really want and yet not break the Sabbath commandment, about, buying and selling here. And so she prays about it and then believes that God gives her the answer. So she doesn't have to buy on Sabbath. She just took it. That way she avoided buying on the Sabbath. Now, you're kind of like going, what? You might have violated another commandment about stealing. But that's the point that I'm trying to get across, and that is we sometimes get these crazy ideas about Sabbath. In our minds, we come up with these little rules about what Sabbath is and what Sabbath isn't, and they're not always biblical. In fact, we may actually violate the Sabbath when we think we're really keeping it. So that's what I want to share with you a little bit about. We will often spend a lot of time presenting what the Sabbath is. In fact, typical evangelistic series, Bible study, we will spend time talking about, how Saturday is the Sabbath. It's not Sunday. And then we're like, okay, my job here is done. I'm finished. And a person, meanwhile, is kind of like a dog kind of chasing a car. And they're kind of like, okay, I got the Sabbath, but now what? What am I supposed to do with it once you get it? And we just leave the person there and we never explain to them about the specialness of the Sabbath. And I think we've got to do better than that. And so that's what I want to spend a few moments talking with you about. I want to invite you to open up your Bibles to our passage of study where you just heard some of the scripture reading. I am not going to read the whole passage, but I want you to read the passage as you kind of follow along with me. But I do want to read a couple of verses, and I want you to hear a word in these verses. And the gospel writer, I want to give you kind of the background to this passage. The person who's writing Hebrews, he's like trying to say, okay, what is the best illustration I can find for the gospel? And he says, you know what? I know what the best illustration is I can find for what the gospel really is. It's like when you're saved, it's like resting in God. It's like the Sabbath. And here's the problem. If you don't understand the Sabbath illustration, you're not going to understand salvation. And so that's what he comes back to. And so, by the way, I think that's also another reason why they were keeping the Sabbath and it wasn't changed, because his illustration would have made no sense if Sabbath had been changed at that point. But, so that's the cheat sheet to this passage, is the key illustration here is about it. But I want you to listen for a word in this passage, rest. Rest. And if you have your Bibles, open them with me. For somewhere, he has spoken about the seventh day in these words. And on the seventh day, God, there it is, rested from all his work. And again, the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. It still remains that some will enter that rest. And those who formerly had the gospel preached in them did not go in because of their disobedience. This passage is written in Greek. But the author is writing to whom? What's the name of the chapter, or the book? Hebrews. He's quoting from the Old Testament. He's writing to a Jewish audience. And so all the concepts in here, while they may be written in Greek, are Jewish Hebrew. And so you've got to understand what he's referencing here. And so there is a word here. That word we translate as rest is really the word nuach. Now I'm going to invite you to say it with me, but I got to tell you how to pronounce it. In English, we don't have gutturals. That CH on the end is kind of this breathy, back of the throat sound, okay? Do not turn to the person next to you, because if you say it right, you're going to be spitting at them, okay? So say it with me, nuach, nuach. It's almost like you're, spitting out of the back of your throat, nuach, nuach. Okay, say it one more time. Let me hear you. Nuach. Okay, get that CH in there. It's a hard K sound. All right, here's how we often translate it, rested. But it means so much more than just rest. It means all these different things: serenity, rest, of course, peace, tranquility, security, quiet. Is this beginning to change your idea about rest on Sabbath? It's not just a nap. In fact, it's serenity. It's tranquility. And see, the reason why we don't translate these other ways, we don't use these other words as verbs. We don't really say he, peaced. We don't really say serened. We don't use those words typically as verbs. And so we'll say rested. But now maybe you're beginning to get a bigger picture of this very powerful word. So now I want to take it and apply it to a passage you know. Okay, you know this passage. Exodus 20, verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he nuach on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and made it holy. Nuach. So God is what? Serene, tranquil. He's at peace on the seventh day. He's not taking a nap. So now you're beginning to get a bigger picture here. There's a really, really good book I highly recommend by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And here he's talking about nuach. And he says, it's a state in which there is no strife, no fear, and no distrust, synonymous with a state of life in the world to come. So what's he saying? He's saying nuach is a little taste of heaven. Now, over close to where I live in Pleasant Hill, we have an ice cream shop. And this ice cream shop, they have all these exotic flavors. I mean, you walk in there and you're just kind of like overwhelmed with choices. And they make them on the premises, and you're going, wow. But see, I am a coconut ice cream aficionado, and I judge harshly, okay? Is the coconut soft, or is it hard? Okay, hard, you deduct points, all right? If I got to chew the coconut, no, that's not what I want. I want soft. I want it to be creamy. I want that milky taste. And so when I go into O'Brien's and I ask for a taster of coconut, and I can feel those flavors dancing on my taste buds, you know what's in my mind. I got a little taster spoon. Now I'm thinking about the waffle cone to come, right? And that's what Sabbath is for heaven. Sabbath is supposed to be that little taster of heaven, of what you and I are going to be experiencing for heaven. So it's really kind of begs the question, how is your Sabbath nuach? Are you experiencing nuach on Sabbath? So if a well-meaning Christian friend comes up to me and says, well, Jim, Sabbath was done away with. It's really Sunday. My response to them at this point is, but you can't take my nuach away from me. And they're going to say, well, what is that? And I'm going to say, precisely. You got to understand the depth of the Sabbath and its beauty. And I come back to it. If we don't understand it personally, it's really hard for us to share what Sabbath is about. By the way, we don't sell cars by telling somebody it's this brand, so therefore you ought to buy it. You know? No, we'll say, no, this thing, you got to sit in it. You got to feel it. You know, when you hit the accelerator, this thing moves. And did I tell you about the fuel economy? It not only moves, but it gets great fuel economy at the same time. I mean, that's how you sell a car. But we don't sell the Sabbath like that. We usually bring out the Bible and go, well, you know, it says the seventh day is the Sabbath. And the person goes, okay. Experience. What is your experience with the Sabbath? Okay, now that you have the biblical framework for the Sabbath, I want to share with you the scientific framework for the Sabbath. And this one is not going to surprise anybody here. It's a really good book, by the way, margin. No one in the history of mankind has ever had to live with the number and intensity of stressors we have acting upon us today. Hold that for a moment. Hold that thought. And let me ask you a question. What is the most important thing for a Christian to do? What's the most important thing for a Christian to do? Sometimes we'll say, love God. Okay, that's crucial. Or sometimes we'll say, evangelize. Those are all important. But what was the issue in the Garden of Eden? What is the issue of Revelation? And what are we going to be doing in heaven for eternity? Worshiping God. If you don't have love, worship doesn't happen. So love is foundational, yes. That's why it's the greatest commandment. But we're called to worship. We were created for worship. And here is the big scientific reason between Nuach and Sabbath. Stress is to worship like kryptonite is to Superman. If you want to just kill worship, bring stress into the church. Because you're not going to be thinking about anything else. You're not going to be worshiping. And that is the real reason. And here's the big problem, is I think that stress is Satan's stealth weapon for Christians. Because we just accept it. We don't even see it. We just say, bring it in, part of life. Not realizing it's killing our highest calling. We come together to worship, not realizing that the lights are on, but nobody's home. That the one thing we gather for, we may be destroying with the stress that we either bring with us to church or we manufacture at church. And then we wonder why people don't get more excited about Sabbath, about church. And especially in our present environment that is so politically toxic, and we wonder why people are staying home. There is a really good reason for it. It's because people are going, it's not healthy. It's stressful. And we subconsciously know this. We say, I don't want to go to that because I don't get anything. Because I go there and people are just going to be telling me their newest pet political theory. I don't want to hear it. Life's stressful enough. Shouldn't church be the one place that I can go, that I can find shelter? We just sang that song, Shelter in the Time of Storm. Great song. I wish all our churches were that. They're not. And that's why I think understanding Sabbath Nuach is so important. But can I ask you a really dumb question? Is it possible that God actually knew what he was doing when he created Sabbath and Sabbath Nuach? And the reason why I ask that is because we ignore it most of the time. We may say, well, I like a rest on it. I could get a nap on Sabbath. And that's as close as we come to Sabbath Nuach. But God knew how he created us. He knew that for us to worship, we were going to need Nuach to worship. And here's another word of caution that I have. When you read the Old Testament and you see the Jews struggling to worship, was worship ever easy for them? No. Why is that? because it's spiritual warfare. And oh, guess what? The devil is alive and well. And the last thing in the world the devil wants you to be doing on Sabbath morning is worshiping. Because if it's our highest calling, guess what his highest offense is going to be? To stop you from worshiping. So he's happy if you come to church and if you define worship by simply showing up at church. I went to church today, I sang, I heard a sermon, we had a prayer, I must have worshiped. And if that is your definition of worship, the devil is really, really happy with you having that definition of worship, because that is a child's definition of worship. Worship is much more complex than that. And all one has to do, any Bible student has to look through the history of the Old Testament and see that the Jews struggled with it. And what makes us think that we are any smarter than the Jews, any wiser than them, that worship is hard for them, but easy for us? It is not. The same devil that made it hard for them wants to make it hard for you, so that when you come on Sabbath morning, if he can't keep you at home, then the best he can do is have you show up into a non-Nuach environment, and he's good. He goes, you know what, I got Christians going to church all the time. It doesn't matter, because they're not really worshiping. Because they're so stressed out, and their churches are so toxic, so messed up. That's good. We have to be smarter than that. Better Bible students. So let me share with you, what does the optimal worship environment look like? This comes from brain science. Making maximum connections in the brain requires a state we describe as relaxed alertness. This is a combination of low threat and high challenge. Low threat, high challenge. Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that low threat, high challenge. I mean, it's like Sabbath school. You want your brain firing. You're making these connections. But let's come back to that in a moment. Okay, can anybody tell me what you see here in this picture? Anybody? What you're seeing is the simulated view, pilot's view of the back of an aircraft carrier before they land. Okay, notice how all the edges are blacked out? Okay, this is considered one of the most stressful occupations. And if you want to make it even a little more stressful, land at night on a pitching carrier deck. Okay? They say at this point that the pilot's IQ, because he's so stressed, and he's just doing it from muscle memory, he's practiced this a bunch of times, so he's not thinking his way down. This is muscle memory. Quick reactions, because he can't think, he cannot process fast enough. It's just muscle memory to land. If you were to ask him his mother's name, he probably could not tell you. His IQ at this point is probably that of a hamster. That's what stress does to your brain. And that's exactly what we don't want happening on Sabbath morning. Because Sabbath morning is a really, really important time. I want to show you 2 brain scans. And these are important. And let me see if I have a laser. I do. Okay, so look up here, the frontal lobe. You see this one? So you got to start at rest, at Nuach. If you're going to be worshiping, you have to start at Nuach. And then worship takes you to a different place. See how the frontal lobe is firing here? But if you're not starting at Nuach, it's really hard to get into worship. And this is the scientific basis behind we're just catching up with what God's already done. We've had the Bible, we've had God's word, and we maybe didn't understand all the scientific basis for it, but by faith, we're going, okay, God wants me to do this. But now science is starting to validate what God has said and why Sabbath Nuach is so important. But here's what I find really interesting. I find this brain scan fascinating because I see a connection here with Revelation, the seal of God in the forehead. Because the frontal lobe here, could it be that science is backing up what the seal of God is? People who can worship. We say the seal of God's in the forehead, and the mark of the beast is forehead and wrist. And could it be that the people who have the mark of the beast are those who never find Nuach, and they just can't rest? They can't be serene, and they can't worship. Because isn't worship the key to the mark of the beast? Failure to worship? And could science finally be backing up what actually that is about? Something to think about. All right, downshifting. I want to share with you this term. When we downshift, our responses become more automatic and limited. And this is what your brain's doing. Your brain's downshifting. We are less able to access all that we know or see what is really there. Our ability to consider subtle, environmental, and internal cues is reduced. We seem less able to engage in complex intellectual tasks, those requiring creativity and ability to engage in open-ended thinking and questioning. See, a great example of downshifting, you already know. What is test anxiety? You know, you've already studied, you know it, but you're in a stressful environment and you can't remember. Have you ever been in a stressful situation and then you're trying to recall details? I remember I was in a car accident, hit and run, a number of years ago. And police happened to show up fairly quickly. Obviously, the person had left the scene. Fortunately, it was one of those times they actually caught them, believe it or not. But the police is asking me questions. And I always thought I was the calm, cool person. But in that heightened stress situation, I'm trying to remember details. And it's like, okay, what was the make of the car? And for a second, you're going, it's a Ford, older Ford, you know, the big ones. I'm trying to come up with Crown Victoria. But your brain, it's downshifting. And that is the opposite of what we want on Sabbath morning. So why is it when you're in the shower and you're relaxed and you're recalling conversations and all these things, and you go, I should have said that. You come up with all these great comebacks that you did not have in the moment. And why is that? Because before, your brain probably downshifted in that social situation. But in the shower, it is relaxed alertness. Remember that term, relaxed alertness? The water feels good. Your brain's firing. And that's the environment that we need for worship, that relaxed alertness ability. Now, we can't provide showers around here. You know, everybody feels nice and comfortable. But we still can do that same type of environment. We can provide that relaxed environment if we say together, you know what, this is what we want. This is what we want our church to be, because life outside these doors is insane right now. We can't control it out there. But when people come onto our campus here, we can say, when you come to Antelope, we want you to experience something special. When you come to the Antelope Hills Church, you walk in our doors, you maybe won't even be able to put a finger on it, but you are going to be able to say, I don't know what it is, but I can feel it. I like it. I can worship. And that's where our churches need to be, because right now we have so many crazy things going on. Look what the psalmist does, what David does. When I consider, and that's this deep thinking, Hebrew word. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars that you set in place, his brain is firing. He's not downshifted. He's worshiping. And that's what worship looks like. And so now you can be able to see why downshifting is the enemy of worship, why stress is the enemy of worship, and why it is so important for us to create a Sabbath Nuach. And so with that, now that we have a biblical basis, we have a scientific basis, let's talk about application. So let's apply Nehemiah 13:19 for 2021 terms. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not open until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. See, back in Nehemiah's day, you're working with your muscles. Most of us don't do that. Most of us are working with our brains. And so our big challenge is not necessarily carrying a physical load on Sabbath, it's carrying a mental load on Sabbath. And that's where we have to be so careful. So here's what we often will do. We'll often come to church with several of these that we're carrying, mental bricks. And we'll stagger into church. Sometimes we're lucky if we only have two. One for each hand. Sometimes we're carrying a whole load. We come stumbling into church hoping to worship. Worse is when we start handing mental bricks to each other. Stressing somebody out. We're going to get to that here in half a second of some of these mental bricks that we will hand to each other. But there's one other thing, too, that when it comes to mental that we've got to be really, really thinking about when it comes to Sabbath. And this is one of these key concepts, because I hear all of us, we tend to think that as long as I'm not physically doing something, I can mentally do it. And we've got to get away from that. We've got to say, what is the big thing that's going on in my mind on Sabbath day? How do I get Sabbath Nuach? Because Sabbath Nuach is a state of mind. It's not a state of muscles. And yet we will treat Sabbath, my Sabbath keeping, by what my muscles are doing, not what my mind is doing. And so we've got to put these two together. We've got to be saying, Sabbath Nuach, where is my mind? Now, I don't know how many of you saw 60 Minutes this last week, where you had the Facebook whistleblower. But back in 2016, the cover of Time magazine was talking about this link between social media and teen depression. So we've been knowing about this for a while. What we had this last Sunday night with the Facebook whistleblower was just internal Facebook documents that already told us that we knew this. This just tells us that Facebook knew what was going on too. And it's sobering. This is what Facebook's own data is saying. 13.5% of teen girls on Instagram say the platform makes thoughts of suicide and self-injury worse. 17% of teen girl Instagram users say the platform makes eating issues worse. We make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 girls. That's a quote from Facebook. Internal documents. We make body image issues worse. And if you think that 13% and 17% isn't bad, increase your tithe up to 13% and 17% and tell me if that's not a little more of a challenge. So before we go and dismiss these things, we start going, oh, no, that's pretty significant. 10% is pretty significant. And here's the thing. Our Sabbath media usage, we need to be thinking about, does it contribute to Nuach? A former Facebook AI, artificial intelligence, researcher who joined in 2018 says he and his team conducted study after study confirming the same basic idea that models that maximize engagement increase polarization. Regardless of the issue, the models learn to feed users increasingly extreme viewpoints. Over time, they majorly became more polarized, he says. So what's that telling us? The media says, you know what? Nuach is not what sells. It needs to be polarization. It needs to be hyped up emotionalism. And so when we get on, and I'm not saying that Facebook is bad to ever get on. I have a Facebook account, although I rarely get on it anymore. But our Sabbath consumption, we really, really need to rethink. And we've got to ask the key question, does it contribute to Nuach? If it's out there polarizing, and I don't know about your friends, maybe you guys have smarter and better friends than I do. I like my friends, but some of my friends on Facebook say the craziest things. And that's also part of the reason why I'm not on Facebook that much anymore. And on Sabbath, I'm definitely not going to get on there. Just simply because it's going to destroy my nuach. And we've got to be thinking, we've got to be more intelligent what the devil is right now, because the devil's got all these hooks in us that he's trying to take away our Sabbath nuach. And by the way, that is a Jewish group. That's the Sabbath Manifesto. They encourage people to, they especially call it Media Sabbath, where they encourage you at least one Sabbath a year to unplug. They really encourage you to do it every week. But we are addicted, to these things, to where we even sometimes have a hard time sitting down and hearing God's still small voice, much less even sitting down in church without him. Here's one last thing I want to share with you guys, or not the last thing, but getting close. Exodus 23:12. Dispensing nuach, because most of our Sabbath talk is in narcissistic terms. It's all about me. Does Jim feel rested, serene, at peace on Sabbath? When the real question needs to be, okay, am I experiencing Sabbath rest, and am I sharing, dispensing that Sabbath nuach with others? Because 50% of the Sabbath verses are talking about how we take our Sabbath experience of nuach and share it with others, but we never talk about that. Look at this. 6 days do you work, but on the seventh day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may nuach. Even the animals get nuach. And so the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. And this is something that we have got to do. Just think if we said, you know what, you walk in our Antelope Hills church doors, our main goal is going to be for you to experience Sabbath nuach. We're going to make it a priority. What does that look like? This place starts changing. One of those crazy stories from history was Stalin's way of doing things. Andrei Tupolev, if you are an aircraft person, you've heard of Tupolev airplanes. He was a great aircraft designer, and Stalin decided that the best way to get work out of him was to put him in a prison camp. It's counterintuitive. I know, but that's Stalin. I think of, when I want to think of I'm writing a sermon, I want to be creative, I want to be a nice place that's quiet, reflective, maybe a nice window. Stalin's idea was a prison camp. And you and I don't have to speculate long on what prison camp bathrooms are like, what prison camp sleeping conditions are like. It's a horrible place. And yet that's where Tupolev was supposed to, with his team, come up with aircraft designs. So he goes and imprisons all his team too, keep them all together. But too many of our churches are like that. We create unhealthy environments, non-nuach environments, and then we try to worship. And you're going, it makes no sense. It made no sense for Stalin doing it, and it makes no sense for churches doing this either. And unfortunately, it's a lot like fishing with a hole in your net. We'll spend thousands of dollars on evangelism. People come in and they go, this isn't a healthy environment, I'm out of here. And we're like, well, they got the truth, they left. Maybe it's our fault for not creating the nuach environment that's better than what they had out there. And that's where we've got to get to. We've got to make sure it's better here than out there. The usual question I get when I mention creating a downshifted worship environment, I get blank looks. People are going, well, what are you talking about? Well, let's start with some of the obvious ones. The mean, critical, controlling people, church conflict, criticism, even constructive. I remember at a different church, I once, as a young pastor, right after I left here, I copied a sermon. Okay, young pastors typically do that. And by the way, I got to apologize to this church for some of my early sermons. I look back on some of them and you're going, oh, poor Antelope. As a young pastor, you're still trying to get your feet under you and trying to figure out what you're doing. And while some of the concepts I think were positive and good, I'm going, man, that could have been so much better. So my apologies to you, and thank you for your graciousness when you were listening to me back then. But I copied a really good sermon once. I had heard from the editor of the review. And I thought, this will preach. This is good stuff. And I remember preaching it at another church, Roseville. And this old retired pastor came up to me, kind of cranky guy. He had a reputation. And at the door, as I'm greeting people, he comes up to me and he goes, "Can you preach a biblical sermon?" And I'm thinking, there's this conflict going on in your mind. Do I out my source that he's really going against, this guy who preached the same sermon because I heard it at a camp meeting? That's where I pilfered it from. But I remember the rest of the Sabbath thinking, man, the whole rest of the Sabbath I'm stewing because I'm going, okay, one, let's just say he was right and it was a bad sermon. Let's just say for sake of argument it was. For him to say that on Sabbath, where is my mind? All Sabbath I'm going, he could have taken me aside and said Monday, he goes, "Hey, Jim, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it." And by the way, my wife, she has been gracious all these years, stuck with listening to my sermons. She will just say, I can tell the difference between, she'll say, it's a good sermon, and between, that was a really good sermon. I know the difference between those two when I get home from church. But she says it every Sabbath. But then come around Thursday, she might say, Jim, you might want to think about this. What's she trying to do? She's trying to preserve my Sabbath Nuach ability. That's what she's trying to do. There's time and place to have that conversation. By the way, no friends. When somebody comes into church and they have no friends, that is extremely stressful. My daughter just went to college, doesn't know anybody. None of her classmates went up there. And going to the cafeteria and eating by yourself as you're trying to make friends, and it seems like everybody else has got their friends. That's what church is like sometimes. We've got to be aware of that because that is stressful. And people stop coming to church if it's too stressful. By the way, when I did a survey with another church, the number one stressor was getting to church. If you're a parent with young kids and trying to get them to stay clean and dressed on time and get to Sabbath school, get to church, that is super stressful. Intrusive questions. Okay, I'm going to share with you my mistake when I was here. I remember being in potluck over in the gym, and I'm talking with Dan McMillan. So you remember him, one of our elders, and I'm saying to Dan, it's at potluck, you're just talking. I'm going, "Hey, Dan, how's work going?" Now, Dan worked over at the Air Force Base when the Air Force Base was going. And he goes, and his facial expression just changes. "Oh, Jim, I got this new boss, and she's just been riding us this week." And he starts going into, where was his mind at that very moment? It's at work in a stressful situation. Where did I just take his mind? I took him out of Sabbath Nuach, and I put him back at work. When we say don't work on Sabbath, guess where his mind is? He is not experiencing Nuach. We've got to be a little bit smarter with our questions. And I learned from that experience because I'm going, ooh, that probably was not the right thing to do. Poorly run worship services, those can be distracting to people. I had a church once that they were excellent at providing AV feedback during the sermon and during prayer. During singing, it seemed like it never happened, but those other times, all of a sudden, people are trying to get their hearing back. Your mind is gone at that point. Poorly run worship services can be very distracting to us. Noisy children can do it too. If we're not careful, we've got to be grace-oriented towards parents, but parents also got to be sympathetic too. It's a balance. Politics. When we bring politics to church, we've got to be super careful with that. Because we get enough of it out there, we need to be super, super careful what we bring into church. And it needs to be really along the lines of, thus saith the Lord. Jesus was in politics too. He says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. You can't get away from it. But we need to be super careful that we're not just doing partisan politics. It's got to be biblical politics. And we take those stands, we need to be super, super careful with it. Moral falls in the family. My parents went through a divorce, and I'm going to tell you the crazy question my mom would get when she'd come to church. People would say, how's the divorce going? She didn't want to talk about it. Life was rough enough. Why would she want to talk about it when she came to church? What's she trying to do? She's trying to worship at church. She doesn't want to go back into the mess that life was at that moment. And we'll do stuff like that to people. And we don't often think about it. We think we're being helpful. We need to be intelligent with our questions when we talk to people. Being an outsider. If it seems like everybody else in here knows everything and you don't, being an outsider can be extremely stressful. And oh, by the way, usually outsiders don't hang around churches long. They'll go, you know what, I'm tired of being the outsider. I'm going somewhere else. That church isn't friendly. I mentioned our social media posts on Sabbath, especially if they are impacting others in church, which you can easily do. Introversion, this is one of the areas that the church we never ever talk about. But half the church are introverts. I'm an extrovert. If you say to me, Jim, stand up and greet people. And by the way, do you know what the number one thing that guests hate is? Stand up and greet people. Okay? When I did the survey at my old church, and it comes back because we would do that because Jim loves that type of thing. My elders, I felt like I was at an AA group because I was using them as my focus group. And they're all quiet. I'm showing them my results, and then I start realizing they're all introverts. And they're quiet. And I'm going, okay, what's going on? And it's almost like an AA meeting where somebody says, my name is so-and-so, and I'm an alcoholic. It's almost like that bad, my name's Joe, and I'm an introvert. Because my head elder says, well, I sometimes stay outside until it's over. Another one says, well, I typically go fill my water bottle about that time. And my wife's an introvert. And she's like, if you're going to say stand up and greet people, just shoot me now. She doesn't think it's friendly, because if all you're doing is it's an awkward handshake, where's the friendliness in that? And so we got to be sensitive to what half of our church is going through, because they say that the average worship service is designed like a non-alcoholic cocktail party. It's like if you're more social, you're more spiritual. That's not what your introverts are saying. And we got to be sensitive to our introverted brothers and sisters as well. And so those are ways that we hand bricks to each other. If you're mean, make that critical comment, and we say, here's a brick for the rest of your Sabbath. Go ahead and carry this one. And then we start wondering why people don't get as much out of church because of the bricks that we hand out to people at church to carry for the rest of the Sabbath, for Sabbath Nuach. And here's another problem. We will sometimes load up Sabbath with so many good things that we're not experiencing Nuach. This is a really good book. It's Adrenaline and Stress by Archibald Hart. And he's talking about Sundays. We would say Saturday, Sabbath. He says, much church activity is unfortunately geared to make us even busier on Sundays, and I believe this can be a pitfall. If you're not slowing down significantly on your day of rest, you're going against God's intent as well as courting stress damage. We're so used to running around on Sabbath. We go, hey, we got a free day to do all this church activity. How much church activity can we jam into one day? And then we sometimes feel like I need a Sabbath from my Sabbath, in some circumstances. Remember this picture I showed you? I want to encourage you not the picture on the screen behind me, to be the picture that your pastor has of church. Because I can't tell you how many times I've been at church and I didn't worship. I led worship. But I got so many of these things that I'm carrying around. You're trying to, first of all, you have a sermon to preach. Maybe you're teaching Sabbath school, so you got all these things buzzing around in your head. Okay, I got to make sure that everything else is running on Sabbath morning. And then somebody comes in and they're upset about something. And pretty soon you've got a bunch of these, and then you're supposed to sit down and worship. Guess what a lot of pastors don't do on Sabbath? They may lead worship, but tragically, they're likely not worshiping. And so I want to challenge you to make sure that Pastor John and Clara, that you're not loading them up with these on Sabbath. That if it's something that can wait until Monday, let it wait. Let it wait. You know, if the church isn't on fire, it can wait. You know, too often we will just say, you know what? It's too much of an effort for me to set a reminder on my phone. So I'm just going to go ahead and destroy the pastor's Sabbath, you know, because it's easier for me. And it comes back to, are we dispensing Nuach? And I want to encourage you to dispense Nuach even to your pastor to make sure that they are experiencing Sabbath as well. I want to leave you with an illustration as we ponder what this church would look like with Sabbath Nuach. This illustration story, true story, comes from Andersonville, Georgia, home of the notorious Andersonville prison during the Civil War, where 13,000 Union soldiers died. I mean, we just pulled soldiers out of Afghanistan. I think, 2,500, somewhere in that neighborhood died in Afghanistan. We're saying that's horrible, over 20 years. Okay, this is just a few years, and 13,000 soldiers died in this camp. And if you look at this camp, look at this painting, you see everybody's just jammed together. The drinking water is horrible situation. They're living in mud. You got the Georgia clay that they're having to live in when it rains. It's hot. And so a lot of soldiers are dying of dysentery. But here's one of the cruel, ironic things of history. And that is, Andersonville is home of one of the world's largest deposits of kaolin clay. Now, some of you are going, I've never heard of kaolin clay. Kaolin clay is what helps curb the effects of dysentery. These guys are living feet above the ingredient that could be saving their lives. Andersonville. They're dying there from dysentery, and yet they are living on the clay that could be saving their lives. It's a cruel thing of history. And by the way, yes, you have heard of kaolin clay. You just call it by its commercial name. It's kaopectate. Kaopectate used to be made with kaolin clay. They've changed the ingredients more recently, but that's how it started out. And that's why it's called kaolin clay, kaopectate. You and I, as Sabbath keepers, are sitting like those soldiers above an incredible deposit of God's grace. Something that our world out there is dying from. Maybe even ourselves. We've got to have the Sabbath rest too, the Nuach. We've got to worship. And yet, we are in danger of missing what we have. Not to mention what the world is needing out there. And so I've got to call you to worship. Call you to worship the God who created us, who knew at creation what 2020 and 2021 and hopefully not 2022 were going to be like. He knew. It didn't catch him off guard. And he says, I know it's going to be insane. And so I'm creating Nuach so they can come out of the craziness of the world. And for the hours of the Sabbath, they can just be. And so I invite you to worship that God. That God who loves you so much. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest. May you experience God's rich Nuach. And then may you take that rich experience of Nuach and dispense it to those around you.